Hi there, welcome to our latest Q&A with the Scottish Greens. My name's Ross Greer. I'm an MSP for the West of Scotland, and I'm the Green Party's spokesperson on education and skills, culture and the media, and Europe and external affairs. I've had loads of questions come in on email, on Facebook, and on Instagram. So we're just going to rattle through these, but do use the comments section here if you've got anything else, anything you want to follow up on, or any brand new questions, any comments that you want to make. The range of questions we've got is absolutely massive. There's stuff in here about what kinds of nuclear power we may or may not support. There's loads of stuff on the pandemic, like you would expect. There's stuff on education. There's stuff on the arts. There's some personal stuff for me about being the youngest MSP in Scotland. So we're just going to start rattling through it. But again, if there's anything else you want to ask, please do just pop it into the comments section. We'll start off with one that I wanted to put first, not because the direct answer to it I think is very good, but because I've got something else that I want to talk about. One that came in on Instagram. Are you and the Greens in favour of safe, non-weaponizable thorium reactors? So thorium is a kind of thorium nuclear reactors are a theoretical way of creating energy, nuclear reactors. So it's a theoretical way of creating energy that's much cleaner than normal nuclear processes. So you don't get the waste, you don't have a system that can be as easily turned into nuclear weapons as the kind of nuclear technology that we currently have. So it sounds good, right? But my answer to do we support thorium is I'll believe it when I see it. Thorium nuclear reactors are theoretical, right? There's no actually existing commercially available scalable thorium reactors. People have been building test reactors for a long time, but thorium technology doesn't exist yet. And if it did exist, I think that would be potentially really exciting. The reason that I brought it up, though, despite the fact that it doesn't exist, is because I want to give you a Netflix recommendation that is tenuously related to thorium reactors. There is a series on Netflix, I think all 3 seasons of it are up so far, called Occupied, or it's Norwegian. So in Norwegian, it's Occupert with K's instead of C's. And the basic premise of Occupied, and the reason I'm recommending it is thorium technology exists in the world of Occupied, the TV series. And in Norway, the Green Party win the election. So you can see why I'm recommending it. But the Greens win the election in Norway and they turn off Norway's oil and gas industry. The Russians don't like that very much. So Occupied, as it hints in the title, is about the Russians basically taking over Norway because the Green Party won the election, which is about as well as I would expect things to go if we were to win an election. Please don't quote me on that. But given that we're all at home and watching Netflix a lot more than normal, I thought I would start giving you my Netflix recommendation. So that's my tenuous link with thorium technology. Is it's the reason why the Russians invaded Norway in one of my favourite TV series. So give that a watch if you've got Netflix, or if you have Norwegian TV channels available in your house for some reason. The next one of the kind of miscellaneous questions we got was from Barbara on Facebook. There are many studies showing that gardening is excellent exercise, that growing your own vegetable is good for the environment. Agree. Although there's a very high level of tenement-style housing in Scottish cities, and many people have no garden or backyard to provide fresh air during the lockdown. So why has the Scottish Government refused to take the responsibility for keeping allotments open, leaving this to local authorities, most of whom do not want to know? I think that is unfortunately very often the case, that a lot of councils haven't prioritised keeping allotments open, and allotments are really incredibly important for a whole range of reasons. Like what's been mentioned, it's really, really good for our own physical and mental health to be gardening, but growing your own food is also something that has all sorts of secondary health benefits to it. It's also really, really good for the environment and for the climate, because the more food that we're growing and consuming here, the less food that we are flying and shipping from all over the world to here and causing all the environmental damage that comes with it. But yeah, councils have been closing allotments for a very, very long time. That trend is starting to be reversed. So I know from my constituents in Eastern Bartonshire, the Eastern Bartonshire Council has been trying to identify bits of land across the council area that they can use for allotments, because there are no allotments, and there have been no allotments in Eastern Bartonshire really for a very long time. The Eastern Bartonshire is not a particularly tenemental area. Obviously, once you get into Glasgow, you've got a lot more of that, but there are tenements, there are allotments in Glasgow. I get why people feel if councils aren't prioritising it, the Scottish Government should come in and fix it. But I believe in local democracy. Councils are elected, legitimately, democratically elected, just as much as the Scottish Parliament is, and the government is formed as a result of elections to the Parliament, in the same way council administrations are formed as a result of council elections. And it's not really for me to say that just because councils make decisions I don't like, that they're somehow illegitimate. They were elected. If you think a council is making the wrong kind of decisions on, for example, something like allotments, get involved in a local campaign, or start a local campaign. Get in touch with the Green Party in your area, because we've ran campaigns and we are running campaigns to reopen allotments, to keep allotments open all over the place, and vote out the councillors that you think aren't making the right decisions on this kind of stuff, and vote new ones in. But I'm always reluctant to say, as an MSP who sits at a different level, that just because they've made a different decision, we should take the power to make that decision away from them, because that could very easily be used at a UK level against us in Edinburgh, and it's not, I think, a particularly helpful line to go down. It's always worth thinking about, like, what level should these kind of powers sit at, but for something as localised as allotments, it should sit at a local level. If you do have an allotment, and you are able to use it right now, obviously, if it's close by to you, if you are maintaining social distancing, etc., then please do. Not just for the immediate physical and mental health benefits of it, but growing your own food right now is going to be really, really important as well. So moving on from the miscellaneous questions, a whole load of stuff came in on education, which is ideal for me because I'm the Green Party's education spokesperson. Quite a lot of the education questions are a bit long, so I'll try and summarise them as best I can. We have one that came in via email that's really interesting, basically saying, do you think that the current circumstances allow us to just reset our whole education timetable? So basically, instead of having the August to June school, university, college terms, obviously unis and colleges finish a bit differently, but starting late summer and ending early summer, should we go one that actually follows the annual calendar? Should our terms start at the start of the calendar year? And is this current situation an opportunity for us to do that? Like, do I see the benefits of it? I think there are merits to doing that. I mean, we're still following essentially an agricultural calendar that is largely irrelevant. Most kids are not helping take in the harvest, but our whole education system, not just our education system, but in this case, our whole education system follows that calendar, starting in the late summer of one year and finishing in the early summer of the next year. If we were to change that, that would be a colossal change. And I think it's the kind of change that we shouldn't be making on really short notice just because of the situation we're in. There are a whole load of areas where we should not go back to normal after this pandemic is over. Absolutely, definitely not. But given the scale of change we'd be talking about here, this massive change to our education calendar, it's the kind of thing that we need to have way more discussion of. We need to really carefully consider what unintended consequences there might be to it. Because don't get me wrong, I see loads of advantages to it, but there could be all sorts of unintended consequences. So that's the kind of thing I think we should probably spend more time really carefully considering something like that. But yeah, this is an opportunity to start that discussion. Not right now, maybe in a couple of weeks or months, but let's absolutely have that discussion, because it is definitely a legacy of an era that's long gone that we maintain these kind of calendars. Here's one from Javier Dominguez. Do you think education should be seen from the point of view of collaboration rather than competition? I think people should hear the idea of their education is to become the best version of themselves rather than being better than others. And the example he gives is, fish are good swimmers, monkeys are good climbers. Please don't ask a fish to climb a tree or it will always feel stupid. Short answer to that is yeah, that's what the curriculum for excellence is supposed to be about. If you look at the underlying ethos, the founding philosophy of the curriculum for excellence, that's exactly what it is supposed to be about. We know in practice that that's not the reality, though, and that's not the fault of that underlying curriculum for excellence ethos. We all agreed on a total cross-party basis, there's absolute consensus that the philosophy of the curriculum for excellence, those underlying principles, are the right ones. But we know that that's not what's happening in practice, because we still have an education system that is way too focused on exams and qualifications. It's far too academically focused. There isn't parity of esteem, for example, between the kind of core life skills that you need to be able to just succeed as an adult in society with those assessed subjects. The example I always give is there's no parity of esteem between your maths, your English, your sciences, etc., and what's often called personal social education or health and well-being. in our schools. So PSE is where you're supposed to be learning all that key stuff, everything from how to write a CV and do well in a job interview, to sex and relationship education, learning about consent, mental health education, personal finances, all that kind of stuff. It broadly comes under the umbrella of PSE. But overwhelmingly, people have a terrible experience of PSE at school because it's not given any parity of esteem with those assessed subjects, because there's a huge amount of pressure on teachers and on schools to maximise the positive result, maximise the pass rates that their pupils get in exams. So what we need there is not just a change in the education system, we need a much wider cultural change, because I'm aware that a huge amount of pressure gets put on teachers from parents and carers. And it's not just parents and carers that cause this, but I'm aware from speaking to a lot of teachers that they feel the pressure from parents to be maximising exam results. I remember doing a focus group up in Aberdeenshire for the Parliament's Education Committee with, I think I had about 30, 40 parents in the group. Twice as many people turned up as we were expecting. So it was a big focus group. But one of the parents was the parent of a child in nursery, a 4-year-old, who was really annoyed that at 4 years old they were allowed to do self-directed play, i.e. these 4-year-old children were allowed to decide what they were going to do, what they were going to play, what games they were going to play, what stuff they were going to play with, because what this parent wanted was like rigorous formal education to be started. They're 4 years old, they should be getting told what to do so that they're learning. No, we need to dismantle that, because that's not only I think is that unhealthy for a 4-year-old, but also it misunderstands how children actually learn. That's why the Greens think that we should have a school starting age that's later than what we currently have, and we should have a kindergarten stage and much more play-based education, because children learn that way. They don't just learn in that traditional academic sense that we focus on with schools, but they will become much happier, much healthier, much better rounded individuals if we actually let them learn like that. So we need that much wider cultural change there. Thrown back to exams and qualifications though, Jodie Gemmell asks, how do we help NQ, as national qualification, NQ and higher candidates for 2020 go on to higher education at college or university, even though their results are given differently? Or will all current students at that level be at a disadvantage when applying for tertiary education? There's a whole load of really wider issues here. So because we've not got an exam diet going ahead this year in the way that we've had every other year for well over a century now in Scotland, we're having to do things fundamentally differently. And that new system for how we're going to give qualifications this year for those who've been working towards them all year, in some cases over a number of years, that's not actually been fully decided and agreed on yet. So the SQA, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, who are in charge of this, they've reassured me, because I'm on the Parliament's Education Committee, they've reassured me that no student will be disadvantaged this year through no fault of their own, through circumstances that are out with their control. But they still don't actually have the details for me or for you or for anyone else about how this new system is going to work. The Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, who is the Education Secretary in the Scottish Government, he replied to a letter from the Education Committee yesterday, and in that letter we had put in a huge number of questions. I was collecting questions from teachers, parents, pupils, etc. So I think about half the questions in it had came through myself, this massive list of questions. And he responded yesterday, and he answered those that he was able to answer, but the reality is the answers to most of them had to come from the SQA. And on the whole, we did not get answers from the SQA. What we got was a commitment from them that on or before the 20th of April, so 5 days from now, the SQA will publish much more detailed guidance on how everything is going to work this year. I'm aware of how much stress and anxiety it has been causing, that there's been this big delay, that we don't know how qualifications are actually going to be issued. I have been scrutinising the SQA. I have been putting all these questions to them. We have been pushing them for an answer on this. If we don't get the detail that we need on the 20th of April, we are going to keep doing that. Parliament is starting to come back, so we're starting to have online parliamentary question sessions. We're looking at having online committee meetings. So we are going to be able to raise this through Parliament as well. For the last couple of weeks, that's obviously been difficult because Parliament, like everyone else, has had to dramatically reduce what we've been doing. But we're aware that frankly, the SQA have taken far too long on this. While other bits of government are moving mountains in the space of days. Hospitals are being built in 2 weeks. The SQA have taken far too long with this, and they've not communicated that. If the SQA had just communicated from the start that, what, we've got a little bit more time to do this. We really want to make sure we're going to do it right, that no young person, that no learner, no student is going to be disadvantaged by this. So it's going to take us a couple of weeks, and you won't hear until mid to late April. I think that would have reassured people quite a bit, but that's not the kind of communication we've been getting from them. So I'm going to keep pushing the SQA on that, on all the other questions that you've asked me and you've asked me to pass on to them. So we will keep pushing them for an answer, but I'm afraid that we don't have those answers yet. We've got a couple in from Instagram that I'm going to group together. How would green education policy be different from the current administration's, and would you change anything about early years testing and the Scottish exam system? Yes, we would definitely make changes. I'm tempted to say that as the Greens, we come at this from a different philosophical kind of basis from the current Scottish Government, from the SNP, but I'm honestly not sure, and this isn't meant as a criticism of them, this is genuine. I don't know what kind of underlying philosophy they're coming at this from. It's just not clear. That's how I think we've ended up in a system where we have a curriculum for excellence with this brilliant underlying philosophy, really, really solid principles, but how it's been realised in practice doesn't actually match up with those at all, I think. So what would the Greens do differently? As I mentioned before, we would have a kindergarten stage. So the moment the UK is really, really unusual compared to other developed countries, other European countries in particular, in that we start formal education at 5 years old. And for many children in practice, that means at 4.5 years old, they're in a classroom. Formal education starts in primary one. In a lot of other comparable countries, you're talking about starting something like that at the age of 6 or of 7. Now, in Scotland, we've seen a gradual move towards primary one, in some cases primary two, being play-based education rather than sit down at desks formal education. That's great, but we think that actually needs much more deliberate reorganisation rather than this kind of gradual move towards something better. Why don't we just make that better thing systematic? So we think we should raise the starting age for primary school from what it is at the moment, 5, basically 4.5, to 6 or 7 instead, and have a kindergarten stage between the ages of roughly 4 and 6. Because we know that play-based education works. It works really well. It helps children learn. They learn much more, and they're much happier. It sets them up to have a much more positive view of education, a much more positive early experience of education that we know results in them doing better throughout the rest of their education, because they feel much better about it. They're much more relaxed about being in school in a learning environment from the start. So changing right from the start how we do it, that's very important to us. We're also actually really sceptical of the value of homework in primary education. There's a huge amount of evidence out there that shows that homework is not actually that valuable. You don't get a lot of learning out of it, but it can often cause a lot of stress and anxiety, not just for children, but for parents as well, particularly in situations where parents themselves might struggle with literacy or numeracy, where they aren't able to help their children with the homework as much as they would like to. So that compounds existing inequalities, existing educational inequalities that we all know are tied to other inequalities, primarily tied to poverty. So we're really sceptical of the value of homework in primary schools, and we're doing some work on that at the moment to see if we're actually going to come to a firmer position of saying, yeah, you know what, green policy is no homework in primary schools. And we will look at secondary level homework as well, but we acknowledge that there's more value for it there as long as it's done well. One other thing that we would do is ditch standardised tests. The standardised testing of children in primary one in Scotland has been a really controversial issue. A majority of MSPs, majority members of the Scottish Parliament, voted to end the testing of children in primary one. The Scottish Parliament voted for that, but the government didn't actually do it. They've changed how they did it a little bit, but in practice it's still happening. But for us, we think it needs to go further than that. We would ditch the entire system of these standardised tests. They start in primary one, they go all the way up to halfway through secondary school before the senior phase of secondary starts. But we know from huge amounts of evidence from all over the world that these systems of standardised testings provide very little value, and a lot of cases, they don't provide any clear value at all, but they do create a lot of stress and anxiety. They give children a negative experience of education, of learning, which has an effect on their future education and learning. They're much less likely to engage with it. It actually also, in many cases, provides a lot of stress and anxiety for teachers. And the feedback I've got from a huge number of teachers across Scotland is they're not getting value. They don't get useful data out of these tests. So why are they doing them? I was part of a trip that the Education Committee did to Finland and Sweden. Total cliche. You want to improve your education system. Where do you go? You go to Finland because they've got the best education system in the world. So we did. We also went to Sweden because their education system kind of became a bit of a disaster zone in the 90s, and they've been working to reverse it since then. And I was very keen that we go to Sweden because when we went, the Swedish education minister was a Green and a friend of mine, and I was aware of the really positive stuff he was doing to undo a lot of that damage. But when we went, and we went to Finland in particular, it was emphasised to us just how completely different their system is, and the lack of emphasis on these kind of standardized tests, on exams, on that kind of formal academic style of judging your ability, issuing your qualifications based on these single moments in time. And actually, children in Finland will experience almost no formal testing or examinations until the age of 16. So we're testing 4.5 and 5-year-olds. They said, no, actually, we don't do anything like that until 16. There's much more emphasis placed on, there's much more trust in the judgment of teachers. So teachers' judgment is a much more of a factor in issuing young people with their qualifications. That's going to have to be the case this year in Scotland because of the circumstances that we're in, no exams. That's actually going to be a really interesting example of how, given that Scotland has one of the most qualified teaching workforces in the world, one of the most professional workforces in the world, maybe we should trust them a little bit more, because actually their judgment of their young people's general ability has a lot of merits compared to putting young people in exam conditions for one snapshot moment and pretending that that is actually an accurate reflection of that young person's overall ability or their overall understanding of whatever the subject is. So yeah, we are deeply skeptical of a heavily exam and testing focused system, and we would want one that is much more about being able to accurately measure young people's abilities, their aptitude, their knowledge, etc., in a much more rounded sense. And as I mentioned before about PSE, we think there should be way more emphasis on life skills and civic education in our schools, that they should absolutely have parity of esteem. This is something that I put, maybe I phrased it kind of controversially, but it was something that I put to the Education Committee when I requested that we do the work on PSE, which I was grateful that the committee did, and we've had some really positive outcomes, and the government have changed a lot since then. I just made the point, I said, I think it is just as important that young people, that young men in particular, learn about and understand the principle of consent in relationships than they get their higher maths. And the reality is that far more young people get a higher qualification in maths in Scotland than learn about consent as part of sex and relationship education. From the evidence that we've seen, very few young people in Scotland actually get properly taught about consent in sex and relationships. And that's a major problem. And I think absolutely, if we're saying that we should be, as many young people as possible should get their hires in maths and English, etc., I think if we're putting that much emphasis on that, we should absolutely be saying that every young person in Scotland should learn about consent before they leave school. So I want much more emphasis on life skills education. And I mentioned civic education as well, because if we want young people, if we want people in general to be successful in their adult life and to be able to engage, it's not just about them as an individual, it's about how we as society can make things better. How can we continue to make progress? Well, unless we actually explain to people how the systems currently work, it's very hard for them to engage with those systems, never mind change them. And the reality is that most people leave school not knowing what we do at a Scottish Parliament level, what happens at a council level, what happens at UK Parliament level, or up until recently, or up until right now, what happens at a European level as well. So that basic, it's referred to as political education, but I think that kind of gives echoes of like Maoist re-education camps. So I'll call it civic education. Civic education, I think, is absolutely essential. Everyone should leave school knowing how the world they live in, the country they live in, actually works. Because if we are to expect more people to get involved in politics and to make more positive change in the world, or even just to be able to defend their own rights when they need to, and then to know where to go for help, we need to teach people about it. But that doesn't currently happen. That was quite a long answer, but it was a big question about what would the Greens do about our education system. Another one that came in from Instagram: should FE and HE students continue to receive support over the summer? Answer to this one is very short and sweet. Yes, absolutely. We know in Scotland that we have a big problem over the summer of students dropping out. That is when the most students drop out of university and college, primarily or not very, very often for financial reasons. So if we know that that's the problem, if we know that's when students are dropping out, then yeah, that's when financial support should be provided. If we want to get more young people from working class backgrounds into university in Scotland, which we do, then we need to actually provide the support to make sure that it's not just those who are coming at it with the existing privilege of parental financial support or whatever it is who are able to make it through a university education. One thing that would very much help with this is universal basic income. All of these different areas where we think that specific groups of people need support at specific times. If our society existed with a universal basic income for everyone, a lot of this would be easier. Some of these support packages wouldn't even be necessary in the first place, and others could be done in a much more simple way. If everyone in Scotland got a UBI, then being able to go into education without, or being able to go into further higher education without the privilege of, family financial support, for example, that's something that we could make far, far more progress on. So yes, students should receive support over the summer. That's something that we could do pretty much immediately. But what we should actually really be looking at is stuff like universal basic income to support everyone all the time to do whatever it is they want and need, like go into education. How will FE students know they've passed their respective courses if they've not completed their graded units in their HNC and their HND? Again, that's one that we're still waiting on a response from the SQA on. If it's not answered by the 20th of April, we'll be following that up immediately. I know that students whose qualification, whose grade depends a lot on graded units, those who are doing much more practical courses are really particularly anxious and stressed about this. And all I can say is that I'm anxious and stressed on your behalf as well, and I'm really frustrated that the SQA haven't been putting out clearer information before now. But as of yesterday afternoon, they told me that it'll be the 20th of April. As soon as they put that out, I'll tweet about it. I'll put it on my Facebook page. So if you can't find it on the SQA, if you go to TES, which is the Times Education Supplement for Scotland, so it's our kind of primary education newspaper. Basically, if you go to the TES website, they'll have it as well, but I'll also put it on my feeds. Also got a couple of questions on culture. So the first of which gives me an opportunity to talk about my favourite name for any individual policy. So a question that came in via email about how over the last decade we've seen this big decline in funding for and focus on arts throughout the UK. The Scottish Government have mitigated some of that, but not all of it. There's still been cuts. Examples like free music tuition in schools and children and youth theatre. So are we creating a situation where there's just not going to be that next generation of cultural talent? I think it's really interesting how arts and culture is one of those areas where you get people immediately standing up and saying, oh, why are we funding stuff like that? But right now, in a period of lockdown, where everyone is spending their time reading books, watching movies and TV, we are all massively reliant on the arts and culture sector right now to get us through, because it is the amazing work of artists that we are all actually consuming at the moment. And we should recognise that. We should recognise the massive value of that and make sure that, yeah, arts and culture are funded. Now, there's a whole bunch of different areas where this funding comes from. So like free music tuition in schools, that's about funding for local councils. And the Greens have spent the last 4 years trying to, we have prevented more than £500 million worth of cuts. We've put a huge amount of money back into local government, but we know that much more needs to get put back in there. That's why we gave local government, or we're giving local government, the power to raise its own revenue through a bunch of different areas to raise its own money. But if we're focusing really on arts and culture, not on kind of stuff like local government funding, the reason I brought this up was because of my favourite name. It's not my favourite policy, but one of my favourite names for any bit of policy is something called the Beyonce tax. It's something the Green Party of England and Wales had in their 2015 manifesto, and it got some media attention because it was called the Beyonce tax. And there's nothing against Beyonce personally, God forbid. I don't think I could handle the backlash if we started going after Beyonce. But It's called the Beyonce tax. It functions kind of like the same principle as the tourist tax, right? So imagine you've got an artist or a group, whoever. There's an event on at the Hydro or the Exhibition Centre in Aberdeen, whatever it is, a big music event or some other kind of art and culture event. If you put, say, let's say tickets are £90 each, and you put a 1% additional charge on that. So it's £90 and 90 pence for the tickets. That 1% of everyone's ticket, those 90 pences. Now, once you've filled up the venue, that's a huge amount of money. We're filling up outside of the current situation. These venues are being filled up all the time for all these big events. So you put that 1% charge on, you're actually going to generate a lot of money. That money could be reinvested back into grassroots arts and culture projects. Now, where those kind of schemes already exist, they often do it for local grassroots arts and culture. But the problem with us doing that in Scotland is we don't have enough big venues. And if we said it's only invested in local arts and culture, then, if you live in the Argyll Butte or the Hebrides or Wick or something, then you're onto Poms. You're not going to get any money out of it. We would need to redistribute that nationally. But the principles there of these big, massively profitable, the kind of big corporate players in the arts and culture sector, making sure that they're giving back through this way as well. And it's not going to put people off buying tickets. If you're paying £90 for a ticket and there's an additional 90 pence and it's going to fund children's theatre or something, it's not going to stop you buying your ticket for Beyonce playing at the Hydro. One reason that I think this is really important right now, though, is the effect of the lockdown could be that it simply finishes off freelancers and small players in the arts and culture sector, just like in a lot of other players. And what we're left with after this is a sector that's completely dominated by the big corporate players. And that would be absolutely disastrous, completely disastrous for arts and culture in Scotland and across the world. So we need to make sure that we are supporting our freelancers, our small grassroots, local community, small business, arts and culture organisations. And something like the Beyonce tax, that's longer term. Right now, short term, it's about making sure that people actually are making best use of the reliefs that are available to them. Not just the furlough scheme, the stuff for self-employed people, that's going to be really particularly important. The Scottish Government has made an announcement about making sure that more people are able to get access to that. But again, universal basic income. If you're a freelancer, if you work in a sector like arts and culture, then universal basic income could be absolutely transformational because it would give you that stability. It would give you the stability to go and create the kind of stuff that we are all consuming right now to get us through this period of lockdown. So yet another question to which the answer is UBI. That's the easiest answer, but all that other stuff, Beyonce tax included. There's another one that came in my culture and media brief, but it's the media bit of it more than culture, but this is about the economy and regulation. How are you pushing back against the enormous concentration of wealth and influence that big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google have amassed and are using to shape our culture and political landscape and further their own agendas, whether that's algorithmically pushing certain media content and views, diminishing or soft-censoring content, or turning big data into actionable information? This is a huge issue. I think this is the defining issue for global democracy this decade, is the impact of big data and these companies, and the profound way in which it can both deliberately and not influence the kind of decisions that are being made that fundamentally affect the course of our world, the decisions we make in elections, the decisions that the governments make, etc. What can we do about it? Almost none of this is within the current competence of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. So for me, it's one of those things where I think if we became independent, we could actually do much more about this. And actually in 2014, as part of our Green Yes campaign, we did publish some proposals in what I think we called in the digital sphere. But at the moment, this stuff's almost entirely reserved. And actually, a lot of it is done at a European level. So the most obvious way that most people have seen this is through GDPR, the new data protection regulations that came in. And we don't often boast about it because for most people, GDPR is just a bit of a hassle. But it was the Greens that really made that happen. In fact, a friend of mine, Jan Philippe, who's the Green MEP, who was one of the leading lights on that. Because it was very much about protecting our information from these big companies and from others who take advantage of the fact that these big companies are harvesting our data all of the time, and it's being used for really, really negative and often, in some cases, downright dangerous stuff. Um, I love some of the proposals that the likes of Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Bernie Sanders have been coming out with in the US. And a lot of that revolves around this principle of what people on the left, what progressives have talked about for a long time, particularly since the 2008 crash with banks, that if you are too big to fail, if you are a bank that's so important, so big that we as a society and governments can't actually let you fail because the consequences for the rest of us would be disastrous. If you're too big to fail, then you're too big to exist. That the same principle should be applied to these big tech companies, and they should be broken up. If a big tech company is so big that it can have this profound, massive level of influence in our society in a largely unaccountable way, then they should be broken up. And that's something that really I think, has to happen, can only realistically happen at a European level. Unfortunately, we're not going to have President Bernie Sanders in America, so unless there's another big change there, it's not going to come from that end. But we saw, these big tech companies, they hated GDPR. They want to harvest as much of our data as possible because our data makes them more money and allows, in some cases, them to further political agendas, or the people they sell the data to further downright dangerous political agendas. Well, at a European level, we can stop that. So for me, this comes back to the need for Scotland to become an independent nation in Europe, where we can be sitting at these European tables, at European Council meetings, have our members of the European Parliament there fighting for exactly this kind of stuff. Because GDPR might, for a lot of us, in practice, be this kind of faff. It's about clicking buttons when you visit new websites, what cookies you do and do not want, what data you want them to collect. Actually, GDPR is one of the most powerful ways in which Europe has stood up to big tech companies and this massive global level of data harvesting. And I know, because it was Greens that made that happen in the way that it did, I know that is a result of direct political work. And we can only be part of that if we choose to become independent, if we choose to become part of the European Union. Don't get me wrong, as an independent country in and of ourselves, there's plenty of stuff we could and should be doing. There's plenty that the UK could and should be doing right now. In the last session of Parliament, the DCMS committee, which is Culture, Media and Sport, they did a really, really brilliant bit of work on this. And actually, it was, the chair of that committee was a Conservative, a Conservative Brexiteer, but a lot of what they were looking at was off the back of Cambridge Analytica and the Leave campaign. And the report was really good, and they effectively held people to account. The UK government aren't taking any action off the basis of it. The UK government is now ran by the people who ran Vote Leave. So for me, it comes back to the need to put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands, to sit at a European table and to solve these massive global issues like the threat that big data has become to our democracy. We've got a couple of external affairs questions. One of them, a very short answer to. Could you help me understand what the external affairs part of your portfolio means? Yeah, so I'm the Green Party's external affairs spokesperson. What that means in practice is external affairs, in the first instance, that's what we would say instead of foreign affairs, because the right like to use the word foreign in a very charged and negative way. External affairs to us is just a kind of practical observation of I'm the Green Party spokesperson on things that happen outside of here in other countries. So in another party, it would be called the foreign affairs spokesperson, but we say external affairs. What it means in practice, though, in a devolved parliament, is that I'm also the Green Party spokesperson on a whole bunch of stuff that happens at a UK level. So I'm also our immigration and asylum spokesperson. In practice, it makes me our defence spokesperson as well. So external affairs would normally be a small portfolio, but actually, because it is not just foreign policy, but is also it covers, for me, it covers Europe. It's also immigration, defence, etc. as well. It's quite big. It's massively varied, but it's really good fun. Another question that I could go on about for ages, but I won't. I'll be very brief. Norman Cameron asks, what are your thoughts on the genocide currently being committed by Israel upon the Palestinian people? Israel is an apartheid state, and it should be treated like an apartheid state. And what the state of Israel is doing to Palestine and to the Palestinian people is a crime. It's a crime against humanity. They are committing war crimes. They are illegally occupying Palestine, and they're brutalizing Palestinian people. And what we did collectively as a global community with the last apartheid government was they were boycotted, there was a campaign of divestment, and they were sanctioned. That's what the Greens support against Israel. What Israel does to the Palestinian people is horrific. And to be clear, that's not what Israelis do to the Palestinian people. This is about the state of Israel, the state, the government, and what they're doing. But they should be boycotted. So the Greens support the BDS campaign, the boycott, divest, sanctions campaign against Israel, in the same way that was done against apartheid South Africa. I'll very briefly give one example of how this is an apartheid system. Israel is the only country in the world to systematically prosecute children through a military court system, but not Israeli children, just Palestinian children. Even if Israeli children and Palestinian children did the same thing on the same bit of land. So if you are an Israeli child who's part of an illegal settlement, so your presence there is part of the occupation, your child, so I'm not going to say you are part of the occupation, but if an Israeli child in an illegal settlement in Palestine, in another country, were to, say, throw stones and rocks at a Palestinian's car and cause that car to crash and that person to die, and that, unfortunately, that happens. Young Israeli settlers attack Palestinians on a regular basis and have thrown rocks on top of cars and killed people. If they were to do that, if a Palestinian child was to also do that to an Israeli settler, so these two children have thrown rocks at two cars and caused injury or potentially death to the person inside the car, then the Palestinian child will be prosecuted by Israel's occupation forces under their military court system. The settler child will not. They'll be prosecuted under Israel's civil law like any other Israeli civilian, despite the fact that they're not in Israel. That's part of this occupation. But it's not just something as severe as, if a young person throws a rock on a car and it kills someone, there have to be consequences for that. Palestinian children are prosecuted under that military court system for standing up for their own rights against an occupying force. They are dragged out of their beds in the middle of the night, children, traumatized, because they've stood up for their own rights against occupying soldiers who harass and persecute them on their way to school. Israel is an apartheid state. What Israel does to Palestine, but particularly to Palestinian children, is a crime against all of humanity, and that's why the Greens support BDS. Now, we've got a whole load of questions on the situation with the coronavirus, so I'm going to try and rattle through these pretty quickly. So first one, hello, given that schools are a hotbed of infection, how can children and staff remain safe once schools resume, given that a vaccine is probably at least a year away? That's from Jill, who's a teacher in Edinburgh. I think this is one of those cases where getting to a point of contact tracing, so not just testing for the virus, but also contact tracing. So if someone tests positive for the virus, tracing everywhere they've been, everyone they've come into contact with, so that you can make sure everyone is tested as appropriate and is isolating. So the approach they took in South Korea to very quickly contain the virus. If and when we are to reopen schools, having an effective system of mass testing, but of contact tracing as well, is going to be absolutely critical, because we do need to get back to normal. We do need to open schools, but we need to make sure that we're doing that with a system in place to contain the virus, because you're right that a vaccine is probably quite a while away. Even if breakthroughs are made in coming up with a vaccine quite soon, vaccines that are going to be administered eventually to the whole human race is the goal, but to huge numbers of people, we need to be absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt sure that there are not any dramatic and negative side effects to them. So the vaccine will take a while. And that means that contact tracing, not just testing, but contact tracing, is going to be absolutely essential if we are to do things like reopen schools. And that's something that the Greens have been putting loads of questions to the Scottish Government about. We've been pushing on that. Hopefully we're going to start getting more answers and see more progress on that soon. One that came in via email that I think is really important about mental health. It says, anxiety is really bad during this time. Mental health is suffering. What would you suggest to do to help with it? Is there specific support out there for people who are suffering? Yes, there is specific support out there for people who are suffering. So there's loads of existing helplines. There's the Samaritans, there's Parent Line, Childline. There's a lot of existing ones out there. But more money is now going into NHS 24 and their mental health hub and the breathing space helpline and web support. So there's a new support line for people who are isolating and need practical help during the lockdown. So that's 0800 111 4000. So the new practical helpline, again, that's 0800 111 4000. But there are other helplines out there. If you are feeling extremely low and you're worried about yourself, don't hesitate to call the Samaritans. Please don't hesitate to call them. But there are other helplines available. I mentioned Parent Line because this is going to be a very difficult situation for a lot of families who are isolating together at the moment. But yeah, if you need support, please just reach out and get it. And if you're not sure where to find support or what support you need, reach out to us, reach out to me, and I will happily help you make sure that you're getting what you need, because it's absolutely okay not to feel okay right now. What we're all going through is a collective trauma, and it will affect people very differently. But we MSPs, councillors, MPs, we're here to help you, including with something as practical as just making sure that you know which number it is to call or who it is to go and get help from. I've got a question from Dave Blackburn. How do you feel on the current system of only reporting the deaths from COVID-19 that occur in hospital? Because of our lack of testing, we have no idea how many cases there have been, but we should know how many deaths there are. So the improvement has been made on that. You saw there was a change in the way these statistics were published, which meant you saw this sudden massive rise in the number of people who were dying. It wasn't that there was actually a massive rise at that point. It was that the numbers were starting to be collected more accurately. So in Scotland, the NRS, National Records Scotland, their figures released now are revealing those who've died with symptoms. So not just those who've been tested, but those who've died with symptoms, because we're not yet at a point of everyone with symptoms being tested before, in some cases, they unfortunately do pass away. So those figures are becoming more accurate now, which is definitely going to help us know more about what's happening and then actually tackle and contain this. Been quite a few questions about the new normal after the crisis. So someone's asking, will the Greens work with other Green parties to stop society going back to its unequal, planet-killing ways? Will we help build powerful and persuasive arguments for a new economic and green order? The short answer is yes. Going back to something that I said a while ago now, we cannot go back to normal. Normal wasn't working for a huge number of people. The fact that the homeless population of the UK, the rough sleeping population of the UK, were housed or found rooms in hotels, etc., to stay in overnight, shows that was a problem that could have been solved anytime, just to pick one example. We can't go back to the way things were before. And with the level of economic disruption, damage being caused by this, our economy can't go back to the way it was before either. So what we're saying is, the ideas of the Green New Deal that we've been talking about creating a new economy, huge numbers of new quality jobs, lasting jobs, well-paying, decent jobs, in a society that treats us all much better. That's more important now than ever. So one example I give is, it looks like, and again, we're learning more about this very quickly, but it looks like people who are badly affected by air pollution, dirty air, are, as a result, much worse affected by the coronavirus. So all the stuff that we've been talking about getting more people onto public transport, reducing private car use, tackling air pollution in our communities. I've got a primary school playground in my area with really bad air pollution problems. That stuff is all going to become much, much more relevant now. So yeah, on the whole, as much as there's specific areas I mentioned before about going back to where we were, on the whole, our society cannot go back to normal. Normal didn't work for the 1 in 4 children in Scotland who were living in poverty. Normal didn't work for people who were homeless and sleeping rough. Normal didn't work for most people in all sorts of different ways. So we need to create something much more profoundly just than the system we had before. And that's absolutely what Greens are here to do. And the Green New Deal is a core way that we're going to do that. We had one that came in on Instagram. Where in Scotland makes PPE and how can we support them to make more? This is a question we've put to the Scottish Government about domestic manufacturing for PPE. People here are actually able to make it. Still waiting for a response from them on that, I believe. One wee example that I've been part of in the last few days is I connected my old school, where the design technology department had a 3D printer and were making PPE themselves, with a former pupil of the school from my year group, who is a doctor in an A&E department, but they didn't have enough PPE. So I've managed to connect the two of them, and we're getting the school making PPE and sending it to the A&E department. And I know there's schools all over the country that are using 3D printers to do that, and small businesses, and anyone with a 3D printer. There's loads of people who are doing brilliant work like that. It shouldn't have needed that. And there are absolutely questions to be asked here about why was sufficient amounts of PPE not procured a month or 2 months ago when we knew that this was coming. Those are the questions that we are also putting to the Scottish Government. But for now, our focus is on making sure that PPE supplies are there. So we've put those questions to the government. There's been a bit of a hoo-ha in the last couple of days about PPE supply. But I also just want to say a huge thank you to the people who weren't part of these supply chains but have got 3D printers or who've got materials and who are following NHS instructions and doing this properly, and who are helping get PPE to those who need it. I think we should all be giving them a massive vote of thanks right now. How can we ensure that a guaranteed citizens' income is one of the outcomes of the lockdown? We had a lot of questions like that about UBI. UBI is something that Greens have been advocating for decades. We're starting to see a lot of other people get interested in it now. The First Minister's saying that she's long been interested in it. It's not long been SNP policy, but hopefully it becomes SNP policy as a result of this. I'll be honest, it's a partisan answer here. If you want to make sure that UBI happens, vote for the party that has always and will always support UBI. If we elect more Greens, we will be able to more powerfully advocate for UBI. We're seeing in Spain, the Spanish government, who were already intending on trying to move towards this, but they're now massively speeding up the process of implementing a universal basic income there. But not just as a result of the coronavirus, they want to implement it and to make it permanent. The Spanish government is a coalition that includes the radical left, Podemos, and their associated parties in the United Left in Spain. The Greens are the radical left in Scotland. We're the ones who've always advocated UBI. If you believe, like us, that everyone should have that minimum safety net, that minimum decent standard of living, and that a UBI is the way to deliver that, then vote Green, join the Greens, help us campaign for it and deliver it, because you can trust us to do that. We've always done that and we will always continue doing it. We had one question about bin collections. I know a lot of people are struggling right now because councils have been reducing or cancelling completely recycling or food waste and trying to reduce general waste collections as well. I know that's difficult, particularly if you live in flats, if you've communal bin areas, if you've not got a lot of storage. Councils are doing the best they can at the moment, but the people who come and collect it, the refuse collectors who work for the council deserve just as much as everyone else to be as safe as possible right now. So reducing the number of them who have to work and have to work in obviously a dirty environment with everyone else's waste, reducing the number of them who have to do that is responsible. That is going to cause some difficulty. Trying to do what you can to reduce waste, to be really conscious about what you're buying and how much waste packaging, for example, comes with it, trying to waste as little food as possible. That's all going to help, because there's no easy, simple answer to this. But I get there's a lot of people saying, oh, you need to get, bin collection should be going back to normal because this is causing us problems. Yes, it causes all of us a lot of difficulty, but if you just put the bin collections back to normal, then all those refuse collectors aren't just being caused difficulty, they're being put in unnecessary danger. And I'm not willing to advocate that workers should be put in that situation unnecessarily. So we're all just going to have to deal with this as best we can, and to really think about how to reduce the amount of waste that we're producing. We've got a couple of personal ones that I'll be brief with. So one is, what's it like being the youngest MSP? It's good fun. I've been thinking about that recently because I'm 25 now. I was 21 when I was elected. I wonder now if I made as much use of being genuinely young when I was as I could have when I was 21, 22, 23, and it was much more of a thing, and you would meet people that would be surprised that someone as young as you was an MSP. That happens less now. Maybe it's because people know who I am more, or maybe it's because I'm just older now. But yeah, it's being the youngest MSP definitely gave me platforms I wouldn't otherwise have had, and I used those platforms to advocate the agenda I believe in. I wasn't elected to be Scotland's youngest MSP. I was elected to be the Green MSP for the West of Scotland. I was elected with a radical, transformative, progressive agenda, and that's the one I'll pursue. If I'm given a platform and opportunity to talk just because I'm Scotland's youngest MSP, I'm going to use it to talk about the issues that I think are important to young people, like the fact that capitalism is killing the planet and all the transformational things that we can do to change it. There have been a couple of instances of definitely being treated differently because of my age. I mean, early on, there was an instance of a Tory MSP who shouted that I was just a silly boy during a debate in Parliament. The presiding officer didn't hear him. A lot of other MSPs did. That's because we were having a debate on the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, and I was calling the Conservatives out. I said, they'd come to the debate to pretend that they were part of this cosy consensus, that the rest of us were unequivocally advocating for the rights of refugees. They came to pretend that they do the same thing. And I just said, no, I was not long back at that point. from having been to Lampedusa in southern Italy, meeting people literally off boats who'd been held as slaves in Libya, whose friends had died. I knew the reality of it. And I called them out. I said, Conservatives are card-carrying members of a party whose policies kill refugees. Whether it is refusing to help to set up safe corridors, the military interventions that we have directly taken part in as the UK under Conservative governments, and obviously Iraq under a Labour government and others, or the fact that they sell arms to the Saudis who then drop those bombs on children in Yemen. That's why I was calling them out. I cannot stand hypocrisy. And his response was, rather than to deal with the issue I was talking about, to just call me a silly child. Fortunately, on the whole, that's rare. And actually, I was kind of glad it happened, because I was getting to him, but not in a way that he actually had a response to the points I was making. He was just angry and trying to offend me. But even amongst the Conservative group, that individual was one of the more ridiculous ones. So he certainly didn't have his own colleagues on side with him when he was shouting about that. On the whole, the ageism comes much, much, much more from keyboard warriors and trolls and like random media commentators on the right. That's all very easy to ignore. I find it quite funny. But what I've really liked is when I go into schools or to speak to groups of young people when they come into Parliament, and I'm defying their expectation of what an MSP looks like a little bit. I mean, I'm still a white man. We need a much more diverse Parliament. But I've, go to schools and, dressed smart, but still, jeans, trainers, that kind of thing. And I'm not what they're expecting as an MSP. And it starts to make them think, oh, well, maybe this is actually for someone like me as well. It's not just for, men in their 50s in suits who've had some kind of super professional career beforehand. And some of the nicest instances have been when I've gone to Young Greens events and folk have come up to me there, and it makes me feel really old. Folk have come up to me there and said, you came to my school and spoke to us, and I joined the Green Party as a result. That feels fantastic, because it meant a young person has heard what I've had to say and it's resonated with them, and they've thought, well, yeah, I can do that. If he as a young person is doing that, then maybe I could get involved in that as well. So that's really nice. And the second question related to that: do I have any advice for someone wishing to stand as a councillor? Yes, my advice is to do it. Too few people in this country stand for election. Our councils are overwhelmingly male, pale and stale. They are overwhelmingly dominated by independently wealthy white men who are often retired from whatever career they've had beforehand. We need far more diverse councils, and that requires more people stepping up and getting involved. Practical advice on how to win, because I used to be head of campaigns for the Greens, is start acting like you're the councillor already. Go to door, collect people's casework, start helping them fix it, get in touch with the council about all sorts of stuff all the time. Prove to your community that you can be an effective advocate for them, and that will get you elected. Getting elected to a local council involves a lot of hard work, but it's not complicated work. People think it's much more complicated than it might be. If you just knock on every door, speak to everyone, help them solve the problems that they've got, then they will in turn elect you. That consistently happens. We have elected people in areas that demographically are about as far away from typically green as you could get, because our candidate who became the councillor just worked really damn hard, and communities really appreciate that when you work hard on their behalf. A couple of other interesting questions that have come in while we're talking. What's your views on legalising cannabis? Yes, it is on the whole dangerous because it is illegal, not illegal because it is dangerous. Certainly not when you compare it to tobacco and alcohol that are legal. And the safest thing we can do if we're taking a harm reduction approach is legalisation, decriminalisation, regulation. And yeah, for me, it is about making things as safe as possible and taking all of this stuff out of the hands of criminals. Like if we want to tackle the drug trade as this illegal, illicit thing that's connected with a lot of other areas of crime, then it's to take it away from being a criminal issue altogether. And certainly to recognise that different drugs are different. Cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, LSD, these are all different things, and we should treat each one of them individually and differently, rather than what, particularly in the media, often this kind of blanket approach of illegal drugs are bad and dangerous and they're all somehow the same. No, cannabis in particular certainly should be treated differently from the other ones, and it should always be a harm reduction approach that we're taking. Next question, council taxes are up. Should people get a payment break during the outbreak? We've been making the point to councils about saying, there should be council tax holidays. We've been saying that there should be rent holidays for people who are in particularly private rental accommodation. That relief should be there. Ultimately, that's a decision for councils on the whole to make. We're in a completely unprecedented period. Governments at all levels are just having to spend a huge amount of money on relief efforts right now. But yeah, for a huge number of people, their incomes have disappeared and they need relief. And one of the ways in which they can get relief is to have relief from council tax. Question about Gaelic. No, tell why, not about Gaelic. What is the Greens' position on teaching Scots in schools? Yes, Scots is a language, and it should absolutely be taught. It should be given parity of esteem with Gaelic and with English. All three of these should be, as much as possible, given parity of esteem being taught. To be clear, though, that's obviously the overwhelming majority of our schools are going to continue to be English medium schools. So we do have some Gaelic medium education in Scotland. It's brilliant. It's often very oversubscribed. That's fantastic. But yeah, in terms of teaching those languages, yeah, we should be teaching Gaelic, and we should certainly be teaching Scots as well. I can't stand it when you get that particular kind of snobby commentary that Scots isn't a language, that it's just people speaking slang English. No, it's not. And any even cursory glance at the history of the language would tell you that. So yeah, teaching much more about Scots, because also I find that it's often really empowering for children, not just to hear people talking in a voice that sounds much more like how they would talk at home and with their friends, but for them to see that that's considered art as well. Scots poetry, that it's something to be really proud of, and it's something really beautiful, and that it's something worth teaching them so that they can recite as well. For children who do speak in Scots, or at least speak partly in Scots, I think that can often be really, really empowering for them, because it's being shown actually in the way that you speak is beautiful and worth learning about, and it's something that we're all going to appreciate together. And then I will just finish off. We've got two quick questions on nuclear weapons, because we've been going for over an hour now. Two questions on nuclear weapons. Do we support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? Yes, I've signed that. I believe all Green MSPs have signed it. Really excited to see countries around the world ratifying that, which not for the first time will make the UK a rogue state for possessing these nuclear weapons in defiance of what will be effectively international law. What would we do about a just transition for Faslane, the base that the UK's nuclear submarine fleet has, which is in my region? We think I'm the only Green anywhere in the world that represents a nuclear weapon arsenal. Most areas that have them tend not to vote Green. But yeah, Faslane absolutely deserves a just transition. These weapons are immoral. They are evil, genuinely evil, in a way that I wouldn't talk about almost any other policies being evil, but world-ending weapons like that are truly evil. And they should be scrapped. There's no compromise there. They should absolutely be scrapped and not replaced. That doesn't mean shutting down Faslane. For a start, if Scotland were to become an independent nation, which I believe we will, and I'll be campaigning for, we will need a base for our conventional naval forces, and Faslane on the west coast. That makes sense, as particularly being a deep water port is useful. So Faslane could fulfil that function. A lot of the folk who are involved in Trident, in the manufacture of the new weapons and the maintenance of the weapons, are not naval personnel. They're private contractors, but it's a lot of highly skilled workers, a lot of highly skilled people in fields like engineering. Exactly the kind of people we need to help deliver our Green New Deal, to create this new manufacturing base with our growth in renewable energy and all the infrastructure we need. So there can absolutely be a just transition for those jobs as well. So there can be a just transition for naval personnel, and independent Scotland will need conventional naval forces. But there will also be a just transition for the contractors there as well, because they've got loads of really skills that we could use for something that does far more good than the maintenance of weapons that could literally destroy the whole world. So I've been speaking very quickly now for over an hour, and I think that's probably a good time for us to finish off. I started off with a Netflix recommendation for series Occupied, Norwegian series. Definitely worth your watching that. But I'd be interested to hear your Netflix recommendations as well. So if you want to pop them in the comments, I'm always looking for new stuff to grow on my list. But it's been really cool speaking with everyone. I've just seen one question. Is it okay to admit to liking hugging trees? Yes, absolutely. If that's good for your mental health, if you like being out in nature, if you like literally hugging the trees when you're out in nature, go ahead. Each to their own. But apart from that, it has been lovely speaking to everyone. I hope you are keeping safe. And I'm not sure who we've got lined up next to have a chat with you, but I've really enjoyed going through the actions. And I will see you all again soon. Cheerio, bye.